Linux gaming is on life support. It's on a life support system called Steam. Is Valve the only thing really keeping Linux alive? We're going to discuss that today. Plus, Canonical is planning some awesome new content for their Snap Store. And the next Windows update brings better Linux integration. Windows 10 will soon allow direct access to your Linux files. Chrome OS 74 is bringing audio support to Linux apps on your Chromebook. And we're going to discuss 5 of the best Linux distros for the Raspberry Pi. These are 5 stories that I will be taking into account. And the first story on the docket tonight is Linux gaming is on a life support system called Steam. So does Valve really have the power to keep Linux alive? This article comes from Engadget, and I love the artwork here at the top of this article. That is a really fantastic picture there. So this article, Linux Gaming's on life support. This is written by Jessica Condit over at Engadget, and as always, I'm going to have the links to all the articles that I discussed today in the show description. So in this article, Jessica, she writes that back in September 2013, Valve, gave us the big news that, they wanted to create a Linux Steam client, which was gigantic news at the time because at the time, Linux wasn't seen as a gaming platform at all. We had 0 games. Game companies were not interested in supporting Linux at all. No AAA titles ever came to Linux. All we had was Super Tux Corp and a few Quake clones. But other than that, really no games on Linux. So that was a big deal, Valve coming to Linux. And really, it's been about 5-6 years now since Valve first came to Linux. So what is the story? Let's recap. And how successful has this been? Well, originally, Valve came out with, of course, the Steam machines, right? They had their own Steam console players that were based on Steam OS, which was their Linux distro based on Debian, to run Steam. And those Steam machines kind of puttered out as an idea. It didn't work out that well for Valve. The numbers of Linux gamers on the Steam platform is still only 2%. When it first came out, the numbers were, we always represented about 2% of the gamers on Steam. 6 years later, we still represent just about 2% of the gamers on Steam. There's no increase, at least percentage-wise. Maybe the numbers are increasing, but the numbers are increasing at the same percentage that you would expect. Only about 2% of gamers run Linux. They have not given up on Linux, far from it. They really have doubled down on Linux. Recently, they unveiled, of course, Proton, which is the compatibility layer. It basically is designed so that every game on Steam should be playable on every operating system. That is the ultimate goal of Proton. So, all those thousands of games on Steam, all of them at least run on Windows, because Windows is really the dominant gaming platform. Can we get those games to the point with Proton to where you can play them, all of them, on Linux, on Mac, potentially on Chrome OS, whatever operating system? That is what Valve is doing with Proton, and that really has kind of changed the game, because now game companies who don't want to develop for Linux anyway, they only want to support Windows for the most part. Now it doesn't matter. They can go ahead and write that Windows-only game. And with Proton, if I'm a Linux user or a Mac user or other operating system user, with Proton, I should be able to play the game. So that, again, it's a game changer. Proton is probably the biggest news in the last year as far as Linux. And just how big is Proton? Well, before Proton, the Linux Steam client already was pushing about 5,000 games that had native Linux support. So that was huge news. 5,000 games on Linux. Keep in mind, 6 years ago we had 0. So that's big news in and of itself. But because of Proton, that number doubled. We have nearly, according to the article here, 9,500 games available to us thanks to Proton. There is an estimated 30,000 games overall on Steam. Once Proton is mature enough to where pretty much all those titles are supported on Linux, then we have access to everything, right? Because of the slow adoption rate of gaming on Linux on Steam. It's still just 2%. Really, you haven't seen any of Steam competitors jump on the Linux bandwagon. Nobody else is really trying to support Linux the way Valve is trying to support Linux. For example, Epic Games, they recently launched their new digital store, and it's going to be the first true competition to Steam in about a decade, but they're not going to support any open source operating systems such as Linux. They've already come out and said it's just not worth their time. They're not going to do it. There's no roadmap for any future plans to ever support Linux. Now, the fact that Valve supports Linux is no small deal. I mean, that's 2% of the gamers on Steam do run Linux. That's 2% users they might not have otherwise. Of course, Valve is in the business of making money. I mean, that is money to Valve. And again, with Proton, ultimately, some of this becomes a little easier. Steam really has been a monopoly over the last 15 years or so. They pretty much dominate gaming on PC. One of the reasons that Steam became so dominant was Valve's practice of offering developers a 70% cut on all sales on the Steam platform. So that is a pretty healthy cut for the game company itself. But they're going to have some competition again very soon. Epic Games, their store, recently made headlines. They're going to give developers 88% of all sales. So they're taking that a step further because Epic Games, their store, is going to offer such a nice cut to developers. It's already attracted some big games. So a handful of high-profile titles such as Hades from Supergiant Games, Super Meat Boy Forever from Team Meat, and Journey from that game company, they've already announced that they're going to go to the Epic Games Store. And when they launch on the Epic Games Store, it includes a contract where Steam will not get any of these games at least for a year. They're only going to be on the Epic Games Store for at least a year, which means these games, these big games, will not be on Linux for at least a year. So that is a downside. And the article does include some really neat quotes from the Super Meat Boy Forever creator. He mentions, quote, "The pro of supporting Linux is the community. In my experience, Linux gamers tend to be the most appreciative gamers out there. If you support Linux at all, chances are they'll come out of the woodwork to thank you, offer to help with bugs, talk about your game, and just in general be pretty cool people." So the Super Meat Boy creator says the Linux community is great, he loves that, but it's still not worth their time to offer a Linux port of their game because there's no money in it. He goes on to say, quote, "If I were to list how Super Meat Boy has made money since our Linux version dropped," so the previous version of Super Meat Boy had Linux support, he ranks how they made money with Super Meat Boy, the highest earner to the lowest earner. Highest earner, Windows, then Xbox, then PlayStation 4, then Switch, then they made money through various licensing agreements, then the Mac, then PlayStation Vita, then the Wii U, merchandising sales, then Nvidia Shield, and then interest on money just hanging out in bank accounts, then Linux. So that is how they made money on Super Meat Boy. So, not really worth their time, in their opinion, to support Linux. Now, the main point of this article is that Valve is the one really keeping Linux alive, at least gaming on Linux alive. But, I mean, gaming is a big deal. I mean, if you want to have your operating system seen as a viable desktop operating system, you kind of have to be able to game on it. And without Valve and without the Steam client, Linux really would still be kind of a second-rate operating system in a lot of people's eyes. And a lot of these game developers, they like that Steam is out there, even like the Super Meat Boy guy, who they're going to release their game on the Epic Game Store. He loves what Steam is doing with Proton because eventually, his game is going to be available on Steam. And even though he's not going to create a Linux port, Valve is going to do all the heavy lifting for them, right? Quote, "My hope is Steam's Proton project really takes off and Linux support is invisible to me." So he wants Valve to, create this Proton wrapper so his game runs on Linux, but he doesn't have to worry about it. He doesn't have to develop for it, and he doesn't really have to support it. So that is why really Valve is so important, at least right now, to the Linux ecosystem. And the next story on the docket tonight is Canonical is planning some awesome new content for the Snap Store. This story comes from Forbes.com. The story was written by Jason Evangelo, who's been writing some great Linux content over at Forbes. So this article is all about the Canonical Snap Store and how soon they want to start adding more content to the Snap Store, not just listing snap packs, actually put real content on it. So Jason Evangelo, he talked with one of the engineers at Canonical, Evan D'Andrea, and learned that basically they have some ambitious plans about the future of the Snap Store. First, what are snaps? Well, by now I think everybody knows about these new distro-agnostic containerized packages, things like Flatpak, AppImage, Snap Packs, which is what we're talking about today. Snaps are this package format that'll run on any system. All you have to do is install the snapd daemon on your system, and then you can go to Canonical's Snap Store and pull down any snap pack you want, and it helps you get a lot of proprietary software you wouldn't get otherwise, things like Slack and Spotify and Journey, and you can also install a lot of free and open source software as snaps if you wish. I'm pretty sure GIMP has a snap, Firefox, and a million others. Snaps also have the benefit of, because they're this container, they come with all the dependencies of the program as well. So it's no longer a pain to worry about, do you have any missing dependencies? Like when you build something from source, compile something on your system, or all the dependencies already on your system. You have to manage that stuff yourself a lot of times when you're building something yourself. But with these snaps, it's all there. It's all in the snap pack. The program you're installing and all the dependencies it needs. One of the things that they plan on starting to publish at the Snap Store is they're going to start publishing their statistics about the adoption of snaps. And they have some impressive stats about developer adoption with snaps. And Canonical has already started releasing some of this. There's been articles published about the rapid adoption of snap packs. And the Snap Store, we keep getting more and more packages available as snaps. So it is definitely receiving pretty fast adoption. But stats, that's the kind of stuff you expect that to be in something like a software center, or and in this case, the Snap Store. What else? What other changes are coming to the storefront itself? Well, D'Andrea here, he is quoted, quote, "Getting developers right out in front of their user base, telling their story and connecting with the community. The current way of thinking is that you open up the software store today when you have an install intent in mind." So basically, most people, when they think of a software center, I go there just to get a package. I'm going to grab VLC or Slack or Skype. Well, I wouldn't go grab Skype, but you get the idea. I'm going to grab something from the software center, and that's all I'm there for. I don't really need any content. If it's got some kind of user review or maybe some star rating, like 4 out of 5 stars, maybe I'll check that out. But usually I'm not even interested in that stuff. I kind of know what I'm going to get anyway. Well, they're going to start putting, I guess, more eye-grabbing, attention-grabbing content, something that, you might find entertaining. You might go to the store other than just going to get software. According to D'Andrea, quote, "You never open up your app store just to browse or to get a sense of what the heartbeat is." Well, where they're going is a place where you can open up the Snap Store, see what's trending, what's being curated, and individual editor picks. So now you're going to get, because the developers get to, I guess, write their story, connect with the community, which I think is fantastic. That is a great idea. You're also going to see more statistics about what's trending, what's being curated, and it's really interesting what he said here, individual editor picks. So the Snap Store is going to have editors, like a news site would have editors, and you're going to have editor picks. And the Snap Store is implementing YouTube videos within the Snap Store app listings. So I think that's great. You know, people can watch a little video about the particular app that they're interested in. So Canonical is turning the Snap Store. They're trying to get it not just to be this destination you go to quickly download an app, right? They want to turn the Snap Store into something more. They want it to be a content hub. Maybe you go there instead of just to download an application, you go there to talk about your favorite applications, chat with other people about, you know, some application you run. It becomes, again, much more community centric. Once you have a community at a site like this, then it really helps development, because now you get a sense of who your community is, who you're actually targeting, what these people need in their applications. So I think this is big news. Already, the Snap Store itself can be enabled across dozens of different Linux distros, 42 as of today. So the Snap Store, pretty soon it's going to be, again, a content hub, and according to Jason Evangelo here, he thinks it's, quote, it's going to become a compelling source of information and community content, not just something to launch when you need a specific app. And the next story on the docket is the next Windows update will bring better Linux integration. Windows 10, the next version, will soon allow direct access to your Linux files. So the story comes from ZDNet. This was written by Stephen J. Von Nichols. Next Windows update brings better Linux integration. So what this is going to do is now going to allow you to access your Linux files safely from Windows. And I say safely because that's the key word here. Previously, although you could technically access your files, your Linux files from Windows on the Windows subsystem for Linux, it was very dangerous to do so. Microsoft basically told people don't do it under no circumstances. Please don't try it, because you were putting your data at risk. In fact, Microsoft had a quote, basically, quote, do not under any circumstances access, create, and or modify your files in your distro's file system using Windows apps, tools, scripts, consoles, etc. That was their previous warning about that. Now with this next version of Windows 10, this next update, you should be able to safely access and modify and create files on your Linux file system from inside Windows. So the forthcoming Windows 10 update, it will be April 2019. This will be Windows 10 19H1. Without getting into the technical details, basically what you will now be able to do is within Windows, you can use the File Explorer, assuming your Linux is running. Start running Linux, make sure your current folder is your Linux home directory, and type in Explorer. And when Explorer is launched, you're ready to go. You should be able to access all your files. The key thing there, of course, is that Linux has to be running. If Linux isn't running, you can't access your files. Microsoft does plan to implement a feature in the future to where you maybe can access your Linux file system without having to have Linux actually running. And this next update will also include some other big improvements. There will be some significant new command line features, so command lines getting better and better for the Windows subsystem for Linux. These include being able to run commands as different users, terminate running distributions, export and import different Linux distros. So export and import different distros, what they're talking about here is you'll be able to export a tar file of your current distro, and with that tar file, you can then share your distro setup with other people. So they can import a tar, so they could run their own instance of your customized distro. But of course, the big news is being able to access your Linux files through File Explorer. By the way, you'll also be able to have access to those files through the shell, the PowerShell. You still won't be able to use CMD, I don't think, just yet. And the fourth story on the docket tonight involves Chrome OS. Chrome OS 74 is bringing audio support to Linux apps on the Chromebook. So this story comes from aboutchromebooks.com. This article was written by Kevin Toffel, and I'll read briefly. Quote, at long last, one of the three main feature deficiencies of Linux containers on Chromebooks is getting crossed off the list. According to the official Project Christini documents, audio support for Linux is arriving in Chrome OS 74. Note that as previously reported, this will not include audio capture, but only audio playback. So we're finally going to get some Linux audio support on the Chromebook, but it's only going to be, at least initially, playback, audio playback. It will not include audio capture. So we're going to have to wait a little bit before we get that. So this is kind of a big deal. I've mentioned previously, because discussing these in Chromebook articles, increasingly we're getting better Linux app support on the Chromebook, but one of the big things we were seriously lacking is really multimedia support. So audio especially, kind of a big deal. But now we're getting audio playback, still don't have audio capture. He mentioned there were 3 major deficiencies. The other two he was talking about, he mentions he wanted to see GPU acceleration. Still don't have that on the Chromebook as far as Linux support. So you're never going to install something like Blender and get it to work on the Chromebook. It's just not going to happen yet. Also, we don't have direct USB device support available to Linux on the Chromebook yet. Chrome OS 74 isn't slated to hit the stable channel until April 30th, so we still have 2 months before we see this update roll out. But once we do, we're going to start getting a little bit better audio support on Linux on the Chromebook. And the 5th story on the docket tonight is 5 of the best Linux distros for the Raspberry Pi. So I thought this was going to be a really interesting article to cover, because occasionally I've done these kind of 5 best distros for the new user, or 5 best distros for whatever. But this is interesting because when you do something like 5 best distros for the Raspberry Pi, you get 5 very different distros, at least on his list, because it depends on what you want to do with the Raspberry Pi, right? You could do a million things with a Raspberry Pi, and depending on the task at hand, it's going to depend on what distro you run. I mean, if you're wanting to game on the Pi, then you're going to have a certain set of Linux distros that you could run. But if you want to maybe set up a Nextcloud on a Pi, or maybe you want to set up some kind of music server on a Pi, all of this is going to affect your choice in distro. So he picked 5 of the best Linux distros for the Raspberry Pi, 5 very different distros as far as they're very different from each other. So I thought this would be interesting to cover. Number 1 in this list, Raspbian. Raspbian is Debian. So it's the Raspberry Pi Foundation's official supported operating system. So you're going to find good documentation on Raspbian. It's probably the most popular Raspberry Pi Linux distribution if you're wanting just standard kind of desktop sort of Linux distribution. Raspbian's great. It's what I have on my Pi. I really don't do much with my Pi. I just kind of played around with it a little bit, installed Raspbian on it. I installed Nextcloud on it, although I don't really use it that much to host any of my files or anything. It was mainly just a project for me. But Raspbian's great. It's basically Debian stable for the Raspberry Pi. His second choice here is an interesting one, Recalbox. So he writes, quote, "There are multiple Linux distros aimed at turning the Raspberry Pi into a retro gaming machine, but Recalbox is one of the easiest to use." So, of course, this is going to be like your old school, arcade style games from, back in the 80s, kind of, really retro games. And that is what a lot of people are using these Pis for, is basically they want to, recreate that old like console, like the old Atari kind of experience from way back in the day. So you can get hardware that will work with this OS. So you can get, your game pads, joysticks, and all of that. That should work fine with Recalbox. His third choice for distros for the Raspberry Pi was Roon Audio. So this would allow you to turn your Raspberry Pi into a jukebox, basically. So again, you're thinking about maybe just turning it into some kind of audio server or something. So he actually mentions Roon Audio turns your distro into a jukebox, but that's actually selling Roon Audio a little short, as the distro's focus on high-resolution audio makes it much more than just a jukebox. So Roon Audio is able to play your entire music library, your digital music library, whether it's from a USB drive plugged into the Pi, or maybe you're accessing it over the network with maybe your NAS. So it does have a web-based interface, so you can control it wirelessly throughout your home. So this includes Windows and Linux computers, as well as Android-powered mobile devices. So that's great. So again, if you want to, create a really neat kind of music server, Roon Audio. Number 4 on his list, Libre Elect. Libre Elect, so if you're looking to turn the Pi basically into a media server, so you want to replace maybe your Roku. I have a Roku. I love my Roku. Why would I replace it? But if I wanted to, Libre Elect on a Pi could replace my Roku. So if you're not familiar, Kodi, which is what's going to be on Libre Elect, is a popular media center software. And for the most part, that's basically what Libre Elect is. It's, Kodi's on it, and it's basically your media server, right? So it's, again, it's basically your replacement for hardware like a Roku. So number 5, he mentions Open Media Vault. You can get some real work done with Open Media Vault. It's aimed really for small business use, home office settings. Basically, it helps you put together your own NAS, network attached storage. So Open Media Vault is based on Debian. It features, standard services like SSH and FTP, SFTP, SMB, CIFS, rsync, and more. So you attach your storage, connect to the network, then use the web-based administration to set it all up, and away you go. So those are his 5 distros, 5 best distros for the Raspberry Pi. And I think that's a great list. Again, 5 very different distros for 5 very different tasks. People often ask, hey, I just bought a Pi. What could I do with it? Well, these 5 distros give you 5 different things you could do with it. I mean, you could do media server, video, you could stream audio, arcade games. With Raspbian, you could do practically anything you can do on your standard GNU/Linux distribution. And of course, Open Media Vault if you just want to turn your Pi into a NAS. And that was the 5th and final story on this edition of Taking Into Account. This was Taking Into Account episode 30. I try to release a new edition of Taking Into Account every Thursday, although I'm one day late this week. I released episode 30 this week here on Friday, but I usually try to release a new episode of Taking Into Account every Thursday. So look for Taking Into Account episode 31 sometime, hopefully, next Thursday. And before I go, I always like to read a viewer question or comment. Usually I read viewer questions or comments that I get from followers of mine over on Mastodon, or sometimes comments and questions from the YouTube channel or email or wherever they come from. I got this one a couple of days ago, and I answered the guy on YouTube. It was a question he asked me on YouTube, but I often get this question, and it comes up enough that I figured I should actually answer this one on camera for other people that may have this same question. So he writes, I'm really interested in Gentoo and Red Core Linux, which is a Gentoo-based Linux distribution. Could be the perfect distro to get my foot in the door, so to speak, talking about Red Core. It's an easier way to get into Gentoo. He writes, I could Google this, but I'd love to hear the info from actual Gentoo users. What advantages does Gentoo have over other distros? Thanks in advance. Okay, so what is the advantage of running Gentoo? This is a common question. It's like, what advantage does Gentoo bring over Arch or Debian or what have you? So especially Arch, because you basically build your system from scratch. It's a command line install, so a lot of people equate Arch and Gentoo, but they're really 2 very, very different Linux distributions. Arch is a binary distribution. You're not building things from source, when you install something from the Arch repos. So everything kind of installs very fast. Same with things like Debian and Ubuntu and Fedora. You go to the command line and Debian or Ubuntu sudo apt install name of program, and it installs in seconds most of the time, the smaller stuff. Where on Gentoo, you're building those things from source. It compiles on your system, and it takes a little longer. For bigger programs, it takes a lot longer. What's the advantage? Well, the advantage is because of portage and because of use flags. You actually build the programs on your system with only the features you need. So it gets rid of the bloat, right? If you don't need Python support, for example, for a certain program, you just don't have that use flag for it. And when it compiles, it doesn't give you all these extra features for that particular program that you don't need, or you don't need ALSA support, or whatever the use flags are. So that is the advantage. It is for those people that really want to be very, very specific with what goes on their system, with every program, building it specifically to your needs. For 99.9% desktop Linux users, Gentoo is not the right distro for you. And I'll be honest, even though I've played with Gentoo a lot over the years, Gentoo's not the right distro for me. I don't like source-based Linux distributions. I like binary-based Linux distributions. I like Arch. I like the fact that Arch, I don't compile a kernel. Arch just gives me the big kernel. The big kernel supports everything. I like that. So I'm not even really the target audience for something like Gentoo. So Gentoo, again, it's a very niche kind of distro. It's very specialized. But if you're that 0.1% of people that really want to tailor make your system, build it from the ground up, and only have your software built with the features that you need, nothing extra, Gentoo's the perfect distro for you. Before I go, this show was made possible by Ansem, Carlos, Chris, Douglas, Dylan, Leo, Rob, Robert, and Tony. They are the producers of the show. They are my highest tiered patrons over on Patreon. Without them, this show, taking into account episode 30, would not be possible without those guys. Also brought to you by, you see all those names on the screen, all those fine ladies and gentlemen that help support my work over on Patreon. Without them, again, this show, it wouldn't be possible. I want to thank each and every one of them. If you'd like to support my work over on Patreon, please consider doing so. You'll find me at DistroTube over on Patreon. All right, guys. Peace.